In this video, I'm going to show you how to code up forms that store its state in Redux. And we're going to do this by using a little library called Redux Form. You can code up your form component to keep track of its state itself, or flow the state through Redux by yourself. But my guess is that you want to get the forms behind you and move on to cooler stuff. There are a bunch of benefits to using Redux Form. You get good hook points for validation, and you've also got excellent documentation with very good examples. Let's take a look. To get started, we'll clone this repo, Hendrik Swanepoel ep1-redux-form. So we clone it on the command line, and afterwards cd into it. I've created a demo branch on this repo for you to go and check out so that you can follow along with this lesson. And once the npm packages have finished installing, we can open it up in our text editor. But before we go into the code, let's go and open up this app and see what we've got at the moment. On the command line, we just run npm start. And this starts up a little web server and it loads it up in the browser. So it's just a simple system that lists a bunch of employees, and we now want to make it so that you can add a new employee to this list. It's already wired up so that when we click on this add button, it goes and shows us a form allowing us to capture a new employee. At the moment when I do add a new employee, it goes and adds an employee, sure, but it adds it with hard-coded data. We want to go and wire up this form so that it gets this data from the input fields, and we're going to use Redux Form for that. So let's have a look at what we've got in here. I've made a decision to split between components and container components, which is a very common pattern in the React world these days. Let's start at the brain of our Redux application, our reducer. As you can see, we've got a couple of actions here. One is where we want to go and tell the store that we're receiving employees. So it goes and stores these employee objects on state. Then the other is to go and store a flag that we're loading employees. The other one is to go and store a flag that we're adding an employee. And we actually use that to go and show the form component, which we'll do most of our work on. This add employee action gets reduced by adding a new employee to the employees array. Let's quickly have a look at our components. We've got our app component, which is our root component. And here you can see it looks at this flag to go and see whether it should show the form or the list. We've got the employee component, which is our most granular component. It just shows some rudimentary details for an employee on state. The employee form component. This is where we'll be doing most of our work. You can see that we've already got an add employee action being passed into our props. And the employee list component, it just takes employees and on add, and it maps over the employees being passed through its props, and it spits it out, and it can call the on add action being passed through on the prop when it wants to go and show the form. As you can see, I'm already importing combined reducers into this file from Redux and using it here at the bottom, setting the existing state on a variable called main. Redux Form comes with its own reducer that will go and store the values of your form on state. To get that reducer, we import it from Redux Form. We're saying import the reducer variable from Redux Form as form reducer. So now we've got it on a variable called form reducer. And now here at the bottom in combine reducers, we just go and say that we want the form node of our state to be the result of the form reducer function. Now we head over to our employee form component. As I've shown you before, this employee form component is already injected with an action on its prop that it can go and call when it wants to add a new employee. So all we stand to do now is to use Redux Form to go and call this action and then hook into Redux Form state to pull off the employee details from there. So the first thing I do in here is I import Redux Form from Redux Form. Now to go and use this imported Redux Form function, we go down to the bottom where we export our component. The Redux Form function works a lot like the React Redux functions. You go and call it by saying Redux Form and then giving it options. Here we're saying that we want the form identifier for this one to be called employee, because you can obviously use Redux Form throughout your whole application for different forms. So this is just an identifier for it on state. And we're saying that we want these fields to be passed through onto state, name and surname. Now that we've got the Redux Form generated, we pass in the component that we want the props to flow through. In this case, our employee form component, which we use to export. And now because we've used the Redux Form function to go and wrap our component, it can expect further props to be passed through on it. So let's go and specify those props. It will have a prop called fields, and for each value that we've specified in our fields when we call the Redux Form function, we can expect a value on this fields object. We specify name and surname. We also get a special function being passed in, and we'll use this function to go and wire up our action. So Redux Form will wire up everything, it will create validation hook points for you, and then you can go and use this handle submit on your form and it will do all the rest for you. Now currently, the form that we've got coded up here is hard coded to go and call the add employee action on submit. So it will bypass the whole Redux Form idea and our values won't flow through state. That's why we've got this handle submit prop here. We go and change the on submit and say this should be handle submit, and we pass in, we actually go and call this function and we pass in the add employee. So calling this handle submit function, we'll go and create a new function with all the hook points and everything, and which will in the end go and call our add employee action. So I've set up this app to use the Redux DevTools, which is immensely useful when you're working with Redux. Let's have a look at what happens currently with this little bit of code that we've added when we go and try and add a new employee. As you can see, our start employee add action fires there, and it shows us the form. Just typing my name in here. And when I click add, you can see that it's still firing the add employee action and adding the fake employee. But it's not harvesting the values of our input fields yet and flowing that through state. We need to go and do that now. To do that, we need to head over to the actions file so that we can go and work on this add employee function. This add employee is an action creator, but you can see that we return a function from it with a dispatch parameter. This is because I've added the Redux Thunk middleware that allows me to do async stuff and access the existing state from within my action creators. So on this function, I can now go and add a get state parameter. This will allow me to go and call it and get the existing state. To access the values on state that Redux Form maintains, we can go and call getState and then say that we want the .form value. Remember, we used combine reducers and we said we want our default state to be on main and we want all the Redux Form state to be on form. Now we're going to construct an employee object and take the values from the inputs and stick it onto the attributes of this object. To get those values, we go and say that we want to pull the employee object from this form part of state. Remember, we gave our form a name of employee. If we had other forms with other names, we'll access their state with the names that we supplied. And now we've got a property called name on this employee. Remember, we specified that we want two fields, name and surname. And then we would say that we want the value. To get the surname, we duplicate this line and just change name to surname. So now we've got this employee object, hopefully with the values from our input fields inside of the form. So let's dispatch that instead of our hard-coded employee we've got down here. Before we can test this, we need to go head over to the employee form component again, so that we can go and wire up these inputs so that the Redux form is aware of it and knows that the name field here corresponds to this input and the surname field over here corresponds to this input. And to do that, very, very easy. All we do is we use this syntax to go and say, take all the properties from this name object here and add it as props onto this input component instance here. And we do the same for the surname field. So whatever attributes are on these objects being passed in here will result as props directly to these component instances over here. Let's save that out and go and test it. So open up the form. Oh, and let me open up the Redux Dev Tools again. Oh, that's interesting. You can already see the Redux Form events firing here. In this case, it was the focus event, the field name, and on the form employee. As you can see, as I type, we've got actions firing all the time, updating our state. This is pretty cool. And now we're going to click submit and see what happens. Oh, it seems we've got an error. And I think I've got a pretty good idea of what this is. This is part of the default code that I plugged in order to go and throw the hard-coded employee onto the list. Let's go and fix that quickly. You can see that because I wired up add employee, this action directly onto the onSubmit of the form for the starter code, I had to go and call event.prevent default here in the container component. We can safely remove this now because Redux Form is handling all of this for us. So how about we give it another try? And now when we click submit, great! It's got an employee with my name down there at the bottom. So we've got our values coming from our form flowing through Redux into the rest of our app. Now I'm quickly going to show you how to slot in validation onto this employee form component. I'm creating a new function here called validate, and this function takes an object called values, and this is going to contain all our validation rules. Let's create a constant called errors. This is just a plain object, and we'll store errors pertaining to particular fields on this object using the field's name. So let's go and write our first rule. We're saying that if we don't have a name variable on values, meaning the name value hasn't been set, then we want an error for the name field. So we set errors.name to a string containing the error for that field. Let's just go and duplicate that for the surname field. And lastly, we return the errors. So we just return an object with attributes mapped to the names of the fields, and if they're set with a string, that is the error for that field, and our component will get that through on its props. But before that will work, we need to scroll down here to the bottom of the file and specify a validate attribute on this configuration object that we pass to the Redux Form function. So that's how it knows what validation rules it needs to go and check. Now this is my favorite part. We're just going to use a bit of JSX and slot in some code in here that uses the fields to go and get the validation errors. So we do something like this. So we say that if the name is touched and it's got an error, go and spit out a new div with the class name of employee form error. I've created this in the CSS earlier. And inside of this div, spit out the error attribute on the name field that we got here through props. And let's copy and paste this for the surname and just adapt it to point to the surname field instead. Let's go check that out in the browser. Typing in only the first name. When I press submit, you can see that we've got our error message showing here for the surname. And you can see from the actions that you've got access to all these cool actions that allows you to hook into when validation fails and all that sort of stuff. So that's it. Pretty simple, right? I mean, there's a lot more to it, but that's the basics of using Redux Form, and I think it's pretty elegant. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you liked it, Go and check out my full-length courses by heading over to tagtree.io and clicking on the courses link.